You know, most of us think we know the Declaration of Independence, but what if I told you its story didn't end when the ink dried in 1776? That was really just the beginning of a huge ongoing argument about what freedom and equality even mean, an argument that's still happening today.
Okay, these words, they're some of the most famous ever written, right? They're supposed to be the moral bedrock of the United States. But the second they were put on paper, they raised a massive, unavoidable question.
And that question, right there, is what this is all about. The Declaration of Independence isn't some dusty old document locked away in a museum. It's a living, breathing promise whose words ended up reaching people and sparking changes the authors probably never saw coming. So let's dive into it.
So, before it became this global symbol for liberty we all know, you have to remember that the Declaration had some very practical, very urgent goals. First and foremost, this was a war document.
The Continental Congress had these two huge problems on their plate. First, they had to somehow convince 13 very different, often squabbling colonies that they were all in this together, fighting for one single cause. And second, they were desperate for help. They knew they had almost no chance of winning without getting France, Britain's biggest rival, to join their side.
So the document basically lays out this long list of grievances. Think of it like a legal indictment against King George III. It was all designed to prove to the colonists, and just as importantly to the rest of the world, that this rebellion wasn't just chaos. It was legitimate, it was justified. If you find this kind of breakdown helpful, do me a favor and give this a like. It really helps the channel grow. So the moment this declaration was read out loud in public, did it magically unite everyone? Not a chance. Instead, it drew a really sharp line in the sand. For the revolutionaries, this was it, the big moment. Their protests weren't just protests anymore. They were a fight for a brand new nation. But for the loyalists, the folks who wanted to stay part of the British Empire, this was an illegal act of betrayal. In fact, 547 loyalists in New York, we're talking farmers, merchants, even some free people of African descent, signed their own document, a Declaration of Dependence. And here's the thing, that central contradiction, the huge gap between the ideal of equality and the brutal reality of slavery, that wasn't some modern discovery. Critics, like Thomas Hutchinson, called it out immediately, using the Declaration's own powerful words right back against its authors. It's fascinating how quickly the document's own logic was turned back on them. Okay, this is where the story gets really, really interesting. The authors might have had their specific goals in mind, but the Declaration's powerful message of equality was heard far beyond the intended audience. It was immediately picked up by groups of people they may not have been thinking about at all. You had women like Abigail Adams warning her husband John not to put unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. People of African descent, both free and enslaved, saw a glimmer of hope for their own freedom. Laboring men who didn't own property saw a chance for a political voice. For all of these groups, the answer to the question, who's included in all men, was obvious. It includes us, and we want those rights now. And this idea just echoes through American history, becoming a tool for generations to come. In 1848, women's rights advocates at Seneca Falls literally rewrote it to say all men and women are created equal. Frederick Douglass powerfully used its hypocrisy to attack slavery. And of course, Martin Luther King Jr. famously called it a promissory note that the nation still needed to make good on. But this story didn't stop at America's borders, not even close. The message that a people have the right to choose their own government created this incredible ripple effect that spread all across the globe. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this global impact in the comments. And hey, if you haven't already, now's a great time to subscribe. I mean, just look at this. From the formerly enslaved people of Haiti, who forged the very first Black Republic in 1804, all the way to Vietnam declaring its independence from France in 1945, dozens and dozens of movements have used the American Declaration as a blueprint for their own freedom, sometimes even copying it word for word. You can even trace its philosophical DNA right up to today. After the absolute devastation of World War II, when the United Nations sat down to write the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they drew on these same ideals, and, thanks to advocates like Hansa Mehta from India, they made a critical update, making the language explicitly inclusive for everyone. All human beings are born free and equal. But even as these ideals were inspiring people all over the world, the meaning of the Declaration was still a major point of conflict right here at home. It became a document that Americans argued with just as much as they celebrated.
It's wild, right? The very same document became a weapon for two completely opposite sides. Abolitionists used all men are created equal as their most powerful moral argument against slavery. And then, in this huge paradox, the Confederacy used the Declaration's argument for breaking away from a government to justify seceding in order to protect slavery. And then comes Abraham Lincoln, who just completely reframes the whole conversation. He argued that the founders weren't describing the reality of 1776. Instead, they were setting up a moral compass, a goal for the nation to always constantly be striving towards. It's a really powerful perspective, and if you agree, you know what to do. Hit that like button. And that idea that this is an ongoing project is absolutely still alive and well today. From the fight for women's right to vote, to the civil rights movement, and to modern campaigns for LGBTQ+ rights and more, those words are still being used to push the nation to finally live up to its founding promises. And look, if you're getting something out of this deep dive, hitting that like button and subscribing really does make a huge difference for us. So in the end, the Declaration of Independence is not some settled historical artifact. It's an active, ongoing argument about who we are, and more importantly, who we want to become. The words themselves are fixed in time, sure, but the work of figuring out what they really mean, that work is unfinished. Which leaves us with a pretty powerful question for our own time.